yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
This is weird. This is full disclosure. This is the second time I've mentioned it today, but it seems to be relevant. I lost my father last year, just shy of a year ago. And so for me, reading this book was not only incredibly satisfying from a cinephile standpoint, the deep love and sincerity of what you've written and how that just comes through on the written page made reading the book as cathartic as it was, movie geek satisfying. So I just had to thank you for what you wrote, and there are always pieces in someone's life that are incomplete when you lose them. And so it's very inspiring to have read your story, and you having put so much effort into creating this incredibly full, fleshed out picture of your dad. It's an incredible tribute, and I can't, it's awesome. I'm sorry, I'm getting all fanboy here. But tell us
I paid him.
Her checks are good, I promise. So let's actually talk about the whole kind of the process of writing this book. There's an incredible amount of family history. The book goes through a fascinating saga before your father's even born. Could you kind of give us a close down?
May I back up? Because I can't see them and you at the same time. So the way it started, my brother's a wonderful writer. He's 22 years older than I am. He's written multiple books. And a publisher came to him and said, we would love you to write a biography of your dad. And he and my dad wrote 2 books together. One was an anthology of American art, and another is a book that's out of print that's fantastic, which would be great if it went back into print, called Monsters. And so he was really a perfect choice, and he came to my dad and said it, and my dad said no. Nobody wants a biography of them. I don't want this, not interested at all. So that was that, right? So, okay. So maybe about 3-4 years later, at this point, my dad, he was 6'4". At this point, he weighed about 140 pounds, was still beating me at Jeopardy every night, smart as a whip, but just, couldn't do a lot, And a friend of mine said, you and your dad, you've worked on these books about art before. It's a mutual passion of yours. He's just, not able to do what he used to. Why don't you work on a book about art? I said, there's no way he's going to say yes. She said, why don't you just ask? I got literally book about art out of my mouth, and he said yes. And so I had this job which allowed me to write in the afternoon. So I worked from 5 in the morning till 1 p.m. So I'd go up, I'd lay the tape recorder on, the bed, I'd sit on the bed next to him, and I'd have a topic in mind about art, or he'd have a topic in mind about art, because the visual arts were his passion. And then it would just sort of roam everywhere. And so that was about 9 months of talking about art and his life and these amazing stories. And we'd worked on a book of essays about art. I'd heard some of them before. And so I guess about 3 weeks before he died, A&E had done a biography of him.
Oh, yeah.
And so they sent over a rough cut of it. It turns out they didn't end up loving it. And so they did a second one, but this was the original one, and we sat on his bed and we watched it together. And he said, you need to go to New York and sell our book. And so right before I was about to leave, he said, the doctors say I could go at any time. And I said, do you not want me to go? And he said, no, go sell our book. And so I got a call. I was in New York meeting with publishers. I got a call saying, and so I got on the last plane out of New York, and it's in the book. And my dad's favorite place in the world was Rome. And I was on the last flight out of JFK back to LA, and the plane that sort of took off that I could see right in front of us was Alitalia going, I was sure, to Rome. And it was just kind of this omen, like I felt like, I don't know that I'm gonna get home. And I didn't, and in those days, there were still phones like between the seats on the plane. And so I actually was, on the phone almost the whole flight, and he passed while I was on the flight. But I really felt like he couldn't go with me there. He had such a love of life, and he was surrounded by, I put together this amazing care team, and he was surrounded by people who loved him, but they weren't family. And I think that was what allowed him to let go. So long story short, I then started fielding these calls, can you write a biography? And I said, no, no kid should write their parents' biography. It's not like we're objective, right? But they kept asking, and suddenly I thought two things. First of all, because we'd done this project, I knew about this area of his life that was such a passion for him, and nobody else would know that much. And the other thing that I thought was that he was 51 when I was born. So let's imagine I became sort of a sentient being by the time he was maybe 55, 56. That's 56 years of his life that I could look at from the outside in. I knew nothing about. People are like, what was it like while he was making the Poe movies? I have no idea. I was 3 years old, 1 year old.
Or a zygote,
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. And so that's what persuaded me to do it. But I have to say, the biggest compliment you could give me was that it was, satisfactory to you from the perspective of being a cinephile, because at the beginning, so the movies I loved of my dad's were the, film noir, the older movies, but the horror movies, I didn't know that much about, and I'll tell you why I didn't know that much about them. When I was maybe about 4 years old, so, it was explained to me that Dad is an actor. And I knew sort of what an actor was because I watched television, but to be fair, most of the things I watched were like the Flintstones, and it wasn't that clear, or Lassie, and it wasn't really that clear like that, Barney Rubble or Fred Flintstone or somebody talking to Lassie was an actor. It was a little bit abstract. So they took me to see him in a production in LA of Peter Pan, children's play. Great. So my mother, I should tell you, was a costume designer. She was a British costume designer. She'd spent a lot of time in the theater and then in Hollywood. British, so stiff upper, pretty much everything, right? So I'm sitting there in this play, first time seeing my dad on stage, and he's playing Captain Hook. Now, I was a daddy's girl, adored my dad, and here is this man I love. First of all, he has a hook. And I'm like freaked out, like what happened to his hand? I'm like, Mom, what happened to his hand? And I'm not being very quiet about it. And like, but his hand, and then he's doing mean things to all those boys. I'm like, what is this? I must have been so obnoxious and so loud that she had to take me backstage during intermission, which you don't do. But I will tell you that my mother was clearly not that worried about my future mental health, because my mother always carried a camera with her everywhere. I have an entire series of black and white shots of what happened in that dressing room. She recorded all of it. Clearly not that worried about comforting me. So I'm sitting on my dad's lap at first, and he's showing me the hook, and I'm freaked out. And then, he's trying to feed me some popcorn, still freaked out, and by the end of the series of shots, he has me smiling and laughing. But I think my mother probably said to my dad, I'm never doing that again. So they never let me see anything scary. So I saw all the things on TV where he spoofed himself. I knew he was supposed to be about scary stuff, but these were things like Batman or the Brady Bunch, where he was spoofing his funny characters. So I never saw the horror movies until I was like an adult, so I couldn't, really be called an expert on Vincent Price movies. And so to hear that it was satisfactory from that point of view, I'm grateful.
Well, absolutely. And I think in a very real sense, the passages about your father's horror films, you're writing from the standpoint of someone who is early in the process of discovering them yourself,
right,
and
right.
I think that adds some vibrancy to the discussion of it. Because God knows, I'm sure a lot of us have read lots of books about Vincent Price and that classic era of horror, and you come at it with a very fresh perspective.
Well, it was fresh.
Yes, literally.
It was very fresh.
And I just, the whole book, I think, is just an impressive piece of scholarship, of research.
Well, I loved hearing the stories of how he grew up, and then to be able to go research it and find out, you know. And my grandmother, she apparently, I read this actually in a magazine article, that my dad said he thought I was his mother reincarnated. And then he proceeded to describe her. She was a chain-smoking, egotistical battle axe. I was like, oh, thanks. He adored her, but she was a piece of work. This is a woman, she was born Marguerite Wilcox. At age 12, this would have been in 1870, 80 something, she went to a judge and legally had her name changed from Marguerite, oh no, her name was, I'm sorry, she was born Daisy Wilcox. She had her name changed from Daisy to Marguerite because she said only cows are named Daisy. This was at 12 in the 1880s, so that gives you an idea of who she was. She was a piece of work. And so she wanted to become a member of the Daughters of the American Republic. She had her entire genealogy done, so that was a great place to start. But I wanted to fill in the blanks, and you know, and so it was really fun to be able to do that kind of research, you know, and apply it to my own family.
Well,
so.
And your family was a very illustrious and high-achieving family.
They were.
You know, one of the major candy companies of the early 20th century was owned by your ancestors.
Well, my grandfather, my dad's dad, yeah.
You know, and you know, tartar-based baking powder.
Yep.
Correct.
Yep.
Was invented by.
Yeah, so 3 Vincent Prices. So we have my great-grandfather, my dad's grandfather, invented baking powder. And the funny story about that is he was a homeopathic physician and he couldn't grow a beard. And so he had this perpetually youthful demeanor, and nobody wanted to sort of bring him in as their doctor, which is hilarious because my dad was all about facial hair. So, but he had this mother who made these like leaden biscuits, inedible, gave everyone indigestion. So all he was trying to do was make her food better. And he went on to invent baking powder and then first extracts of vanilla, breakfast cereals, dog foods. He became this huge name in the food industry. And then his son, also Vincent Price, was the head of the largest candy company in the United States.
National Candy Company.
National Candy Company. So.
Which also, what's fascinating about that, one of the fascinating things about that is that your father was such a black sheep considering what had been happening with the rest of the family.
Yeah.
He was acting from an early age, obviously. I read he was in, I think it was Robin Hood.
Robin Hood, as Robin Hood,
there we go.
Starring.
Give us an idea of what things were like as he became more serious about acting, culminating in, you know, Broadway, Helen Hayes.
Well, so first of all, I should say that, you know, he wanted to act. He went to this sort of arty school called the Community School, which is now very chic and distinguished, and he actually was named a distinguished alum last year. But it was an arty school at the time, and it was a very experiential school, so kids got to do everything and learn all these things. And he was in plays, and he loved it. Then he went to a more distinguished school, St. Louis Country Day, and he never got cast again. And so he would make these really cheesy home movies instead, where he got to act and do things like that. But he was always stage managing, but he never got to really act. Then he went to Yale, where his father and his brother had gone before him, and wanted to act at Yale, also never got cast. So he joined the Elizabethan Club, which did a lot of Shakespeare, and then he joined the Yale Glee Club, which toured the world singing. So he got the sort of performance thing. When he was a senior in college, he met the most famous person he'd ever met, and he was James Thurber, the great American cartoonist and essayist, and they became great friends. And so he asked Mr. Thurber's advice. He said, you know, all I really wanted to do is act, you know? And what do you think of that idea? And Thurber was like, are you kidding me? I mean, you couldn't even get cast in college. What, are you gonna just show up on Broadway? So that's why he went to graduate school in London studying art history. But while he was there, he kept going to theater and kept going to theater, and finally his roommates dared him to try out for a play. And he got the part.
That was Chicago.
Chicago, yep. And then the next play at that little private theater club was Victoria Regina. And it was it got a lot of attention. So in those days, unlike now with The Crown, you literally could not depict a monarch on the public stage until they had been dead for 50 years, and Queen Victoria had only been dead like 20 years. And so, but this private theater club was producing this very distinguished play. And so he did this play, he got cast as Prince Albert, and he was named Male Newcomer of the Year in the British theater. It was like off the charts success right off the bat. So.
That put him in, that role of Prince Albert in Victoria Regina put him, ultimately, he was doing that on Broadway with Helen Hayes.
So what happened was he became great friends with the playwright. So the playwright was a man named Lawrence Houseman, and his brother was the famous poet A.E. Houseman. And my dad became great friends with him, so this American impresario came over to buy the play, and Lawrence Houseman refused to sell it to him unless my dad went with him. And so the playwright, the producer thought my dad was this big star in England, and my dad was a graduate student. And so my dad, bought the only ticket he could afford to go back, which was in steerage. And so the producer he bought it as a vehicle for the First Lady of the American Theater, Helen Hayes, and so he had the press waiting at the first class gangplank. And my dad wasn't in first class. He and his cat, named Albert, were in steerage, so he just walked off.
I will never complain about Coach again.
Yeah. And so he went to his little hotel, checked in, he came to the rehearsal the next day, and the guy was just furious, like screaming, "How dare you pull a Garbo and escape the press?" And he's like, "What are you talking about?" He thought my dad was this huge star, and he was a graduate student. So it was complete, literally overnight success.
There was a huge amount of critical acclaim, and there's a wonderful bit of advice that Ms. Hayes offered your father. If you could tell us about that.
Sure, yeah. So literally, it was overnight success. He was this gorgeous matinee idol. It was kind of embarrassing as his daughter to read some of the reviews. Especially the ones written by women. He is a child of the gods. And the women would be like the pictures of him at the stage door with all these surrounded by these adoring women. So Universal came and offered him $1 million movie contract, and this is in the middle of the Depression. Wow. And my dad had the courage to not just say yes, but to go, and he came from a wealthy family, but $1 million is like a whole other kind of wealth,
Especially back then,
yeah. And so he asked Miss Hayes her advice, and she said, "Do you want to be a flash in the pan?" And my dad said no, and she said, "Do you think you know your craft?" And my dad said, "Well, how could I? I've barely done anything." And she said, "Then turn it down and learn how to become an actor." So in those days, Broadway was closed in the summers. There was no air conditioning. And so basically the actors all went to these wonderful sort of idyllic spots all over the East Coast doing plays. And there were amazing plays with amazing actors. So my dad did Victoria Regina for 2 years, 9 months, and then 3 months of, 3-4 different plays. And so finally he felt like, he'd done 20, 30 things, and he was an actor. And then he went out to Hollywood thinking, this is it, I'm gonna be, this actor. And they took one look at that pretty face and they cast him in a screwball comedy, and he hated it. Literally, he never said a good word. It's called Service Deluxe. He never said a good word about that movie. When I finally saw it, I thought, oh, this is gonna be horrible. And it was just, your basic—
It's a fluffy
screwball comedy, but it wasn't like terrible, it wasn't great, it just was a screwball comedy. But he wanted to be a character actor. The actors he admired were Edward G. Robinson and Jimmy Cagney and Spencer Tracy, but he didn't look like that. So it took him a long time to figure out how somebody who was 6'4" and beautifully spoken and had this, beautiful face could become a character actor, but he finally did.
And did it very well.
Yeah.
And throughout the 30s and 40s, there were a lot of, you see him demonstrating a lot of range, and you brought up at one point, I think in one interview, you brought up a very good point about how one of the ways you could make a handsome, charismatic, leading man material guy into a valid character actor is to just make him the heavy, and for him to just drink in being bad.
Yes, well, he really understood, and I think everybody in this room wouldn't, disagree. the bad guys have a lot more fun. You know? And so he did this play. It was, it opened, I think, December 5th, 1942, and it was called Angel Street, and it would later become Gaslight, the movie, but it's where the term gaslight came from. And he played Mr. Manningham, and as he did often throughout his career and a few times in his life, he was trying to get rid of a wife. And so he, you know, gaslit
Read the
her.
book.
Yeah. He was trying to, you know, make her believe she was going crazy. But it was a melodrama. It's still the longest running melodrama on Broadway. And he said that when he, you know, felt the audience hate him, when they were hissing, you know, and all of that, he was like, this is it. Because he was, you know, in the, as he often was, the smoking jacket and the dressing gown and the ascot and the whole thing. But, you know, he was trying to get rid of the wife. And that's when he understood he could be a gothic villain. And in the 40s, he did that quite a bit. I think if you haven't seen this movie, you've probably seen some of his film noirs, but I think the movie from the 40s that sort of pre-stages who he was in the Poe films and the later movies, it's a movie called Dragonwyck. And it was a hugely popular book. My dad read the book, contemporary book, and he said, I want that part. And he was doing a movie with the man who was going to direct Dragonwyck, but he was producing this movie. And it was a movie called Keys to the Kingdom with Gregory Peck and Roddy McDowell, and my dad plays this sort of, you know, slightly evil fat priest. And, you know, and the director looked at him, Joseph Mankiewicz looked at him, and he was like, you're like this fat priest, the guy's an opium addict. So my dad lost 60 pounds to audition for the part. Wow. And he got it. And it was a huge deal for him to get that part. And it was opposite Gene Tierney, you know, it's a fantastic role. And it was really that part where he is that sort of, as my dad later said, a man besieged by fate. You know, he's a aristocratic New Yorker. And the irony is, here's a funny thing that he never knew. So my dad believed that he was, Price is a Welsh name. It's a very common Welsh name like Smith or Jones. And my dad believed he was Welsh. Many years later, I was in Wales, and the BBC wanted to do a piece on my dad's Welsh heritage, and where I was in Wales is where the genealogy, the whole genealogy library for the British Isles is. So they assigned this genealogist, and we're gonna do an interview. So we're about to have a nice lunch together before the BBC interview, blah, blah, blah. And the guy comes down in this panic. He said, I've never had this happen before. I can't find a single connection between your dad and Wales, and we're gonna be on TV. You know, he's in this panic. He said, is there anything? I said, well, I don't know of anything, but my mom was born in Wales. He goes, great. And he goes running away. He does the whole thing on my mom, who literally was born in Wales, so that was good, covered the BBC thing. But 3 days later, he emails me and he said, it just was so disturbing. He said, you're not Welsh. I was like, oh. He said, you're Dutch. And it all made sense. So it was at De Vries, his family came over, I mean, many generations back, came over for seeking religious freedom, settled in the Hudson River Valley. There's a ton of Dutch there. And coming back to Dragonwyck, that's who my dad played, and he was an aristocratic Dutchman. So De Vries became Price, but my dad never knew it. And of course, whenever I go to Holland, I'm like, my people, they're all gigantic, they're blonde. Of course my dad was Dutch. The Welsh are like this tall and dark. So, of course he was Dutch.
Totally tracks.
Yeah.
I know that you've said in the past that probably your favorite role of his is in Otto Preminger's Laura.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to geek out on that for a second, because first of all, I think it's a brilliant movie, and I think he is incredible in that movie. There's something almost contemporary about that character, this charming but essentially kind of useless guy, but he embodies that so well, and that character has so much internal life, and he's so like jaded and quippy, but there's like a lot underneath that.
Yep.
It's just a terrific role, and it's a great movie.
You know, I think the interesting thing is, you know, obviously the reason we're all sitting here talking about my dad on a Saturday 32 years after he died is because of the horror films. and because of horror fans. That's why, you know, I mean, otherwise I'd be at the occasional TCM or old movie thing. I mean, there were people way more famous than my dad who people don't remember. You know, Robert Taylor, infinitely more famous than my dad, and you know, there's not.
He's now talking about.
No. So, so it's clearly the horror, but the slight downside of that is because my dad, you know, often mixed the camp and the horror and the humor and all of that, people don't realize what a capacity he had to be a really strong actor.
Absolutely.
And it kind of colored people's view of him. He never won, you know, an Oscar. He was never nominated. He was never, you know, given an honorary Oscar, never given a Kennedy Center award. You know, that's the one that pisses me off because he did so much for the arts, you know. And I think, you know, that's why I love films like Laura, because you see, and he looks so young in it, you see what a really good actor he was.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, and that obviously comes, you know, comes through in the horror films, but that just is like just about a high watermark for me as far as one of my favorites as well. Yeah. One of the other things I kind of wanted to address with the book, which is amazing, is there's a literal all-star cast of people who were eager and ready to provide their recollections with your dad. That seems like it must have been like kind of an epic, kind of exciting journey in and of itself. I mean, she talked to Robert Mitchum. She talked to Johnny Depp, like literally scores of like some of the most amazing film and stage actors on the planet, and they were there with all these testimonies and all these great stories. So
yeah, it was an amazing group of people. I mean, I'll tell you, this is fun. I never get to tell these stories. So Robert Mitchum was a complete fun accident. So my dad and Jane Russell were really, really close. Aunt Jane, and we all called her Aunt Jane. And so, of course, you know, I knew I was going to call her because and she said, oh, come up and spend the weekend at, you know, she lived in Montecito, which is where, you know, all the celebrities live, like Prince Harry and Meghan, you know, near Santa Barbara. And so I, you know, it was pre-cell phones and you had a camera with you everywhere. And she showed me to her guest room and I was like, this is so Hollywood. The entire guest room was leopard print. I mean, like every square inch of it.
That is, if Jane Russell had anything less, I would have been disappointed and shocked.
Perfect. Yes.
That's awesome.
I mean, the wallpaper, everything was leopard print. And she said, oh, I've invited a friend over, so we're gonna sit and chat, you know. And the friend was Bob Mitchum, right? So, and she, you know, knew to have a nice, good bottle of tequila there, and, you know, a few judicial sips of that, and I got his entire life story, not just his memories of my dad, but I mean, the boxcar to Hollywood, you know, that was the best part of it. So my background is, you know, I'm an academic, you know, and I actually did my doctoral work on celebrity and my PhDs in American Studies, you know, all those kinds of stories. So, you know, to get to listen to, you know, Bob Mitchum, but I got to interview Christopher Lee, Diana Rigg, Alec Guinness, I mean, you know, it was amazing, wow. You know, and literally with the carte blanche of, hi, my name, you know, in those days you also wrote letters to people. My name is Victoria Price, I'm Vincent Price's daughter, and literally it was always a yes. And nobody, and not because I was his daughter, nobody had a bad word to say about him. He was so loved and so beloved, you know? And it's even fun when I go to these conventions, and every so often, like I remember at Chiller, they had sort of a Mod Squad reunion song, Peggy Lipton, obviously. And my dad had done an episode of Mod Squad, and for those of you who are too young, it was a really fun, I loved that show. It's late 60s.
Hippie cops, basically.
Yeah, hippie cops, it was fabulous. And my dad's episode was mostly with Peggy Lipton, and they became very good friends, and that, horror fans, Peggy Lipton is why my dad did Thriller, because Peggy Lipton was married to Quincy Jones, and when Michael Jackson wanted to do Thriller, she's the one who said, well, of course you've got to get Vincent, so you can thank Mod Squad and Peggy Lipton for Thriller. But anyway, long story short, they had this little thing at Chiller, and I was going in to say hi to someone, and the two guys were there, and literally, like, their whole face lit up. And this would happen all the time. At Chiller is a place where I've seen a lot of them. I was walking down the aisle, and I ran into Robert Wagner, who I know slightly, and I said hello to him, and he was locked out of his thing And so he was just stuck there. He couldn't get into his room, and he's stuck there, and he literally wouldn't let me go. He's like, he wanted to tell me all of his favorite Vincent stories. He couldn't wait. And then his wife comes up, and she'll sing John,
yeah.
and she comes up, and and you can tell she's like annoyed that she's going to have to sit there and talk. And he's like, this is Vincent's daughter, and then he tells her all the stories. People love talking about my dad. That's how, it wasn't fake. It was not fake. People loved my dad. So.
Well, and that comes through in the book as well.
Yeah.
And I think just from reading the book and from listening to the podcast which there's a very interesting story about that book that's sort of, the podcast is sort of promoting, that really comes through in your writing. There's a love of life in there and a readiness to embrace it, adversities and all, that it seems like that came from, you got part of that from your dad for sure.
The real gift was, okay, so first of all, we've all had someone in our life who sort of woke something up in us. The thing that I didn't really understand about the horror community, sorry, because I didn't understand why you people like scary movies. So, when I first started coming to horror conventions, like, who are these people going to be? I never got that it was a family thing, and once I started coming to horror conventions, I was like, oh my God, it's a family thing. For me and my dad, it was like art or travel or whatever, but it's the same thing with horror. It's completely a family thing. This love of, I watched it with my grandma, I watched it with my mom, I watched it with my brother and sister. It's that complete family connection, right? And so, after my dad was gone, I because when you're the kid of somebody famous, people fixate on the fame part of it. Celebrity is a currency in our society.
Absolutely.
It probably even trumps, money. And, it's like, it's something that people care about. And you forget because of that, because people want to know, what was it like? What was it like? So I'm about 49 years old, and I had this epiphany. And it happened to be the year my dad would have turned 100. And I had this epiphany. I was looking at myself in the mirror one day, and I heard myself saying these really positive things to myself. You're doing everything right. I'd had this horrible thing happen in my life. I turned it around, and you're doing everything right. I gave myself this whole pep talk, and then I heard myself say, but you're miserable. And if you have to keep living like this for another 30 years, you're not gonna make it. This is not living. Well, literally like the month later, the 100-year birthday started, and somebody very cleverly called it the Vincentennial. And so I got invited, because I'd written the book, to go around talking about my dad all over, and they were big events, and I went all over the world doing it. I still had a real job, so I would go home and do I still do have a real job, but but at that point it was a different real job, and I'd go home to my, kind of life when I came back from these things. But what I decided to talk about at the things was not about what my dad did with his life, which is what I did on the book tour, but how he lived his life. And in order to talk about how he lived his life, I kind of had to feel what he made me feel. And then I realized that that's really what people wanted. Like, I'm pretty sure that most of you know as much or more about my dad's career than I do. You probably do, But what you don't know is kind of who he was. And so I realized there was a win-win. People wanted to feel what it would have been like to meet my dad, and believe me, I am a very poor substitute. But my dad was the kind of person, like, he walked in a room. No, really, he was like the kind of person who walked in a room, was like the roof blew off and the sun came shining. He was just this huge bright light, But what I would do when I got home was, I remembered that what he gave me wasn't the fame, it wasn't the celebrity, it was joy. And I was like, and then when I started doing horror conventions, I got that's what he brought all of you to, joy. And so I started thinking about, well, what is joy, right? And I read this very simple definition: joy is the pure and simple delight in being alive. And he made people feel that, which is ironic, because let's face it, he's like, killing people. But he, there's this joy, and I think, he understood that you have to go into the dark and face your fears, but if there's a safe place to face your fears, you're much more capable of going out into the world and facing the truly scary stuff, you know? And so then I thought, well, I've got to have more joy in my life. But it took another 3 years for me to get there. And so honestly, that's what the gift of my dad was to me, and the gift in this sort of second half of life of remembering that I continue to have to practice joy. I started this blog called Daily Practice of Joy. And I called my best friend at the time and I'm like, I'm starting this blog called Daily Practice of Joy, and I'm gonna write about how joy is changing my life. And she said, shouldn't you see if it works first? I was like, thanks. She said, well, you're pretty much the most miserable person I know. Thank you. But you know, it worked. And coming to the conventions has been a big part of it for me, because it's like this joy exchange, you know? And there's this thing, it's kind of like, you know, when I wrote to all the celebrities, like if I'm in a crappy mood and I talk to a horror fan who tells me what they loved about my dad, it's like literally like, you know, I'm just mainlining some joy, you know? And honestly, it's like this exchange, and it makes me feel like I have this huge family out in the world of people I don't know who love the same person I love. And that's, honestly, I mean, we all have people we love, and how many of you get to go share that person with other people? I love my dog, and no one's paying me to come talk about my dog. So it's a gift, and you all are a gift, really. Thank you. It's true.
We have a few minutes, and speaking of sharing joy, I'd love to take some questions from the audience for Victoria. Anyone? Yes.
For me? I'm sorry.
Yes, for you.
So I have the cookbooks. I'm here for the movie, but I have the cookbooks.
Cool.
And we came across a final record of him recording for the California Wine Institute, wine pairing and a whole feast. And we do it every year. So
Oh,
we do
fun.
nice dinner every year.
Fabulous.
And I wanted to find out from you what you loved about when you were a child, like when you think about some of the food that you ate, like what would you go back to?
Absolutely. Well, so here's the humorous part, and my friend Karen is sitting back there. I am like the pickiest eater in the world. I eat literally maybe 13 things, and most of them not very joyfully. And my parents, I was like, they were like, how did we get her? But there were these things that now, like, literally, like, allergies be damned, I would have them. So one was my dad made this souffle, and a cheese souffle. And cheese souffles are hard to make. And the trick is they have to be fluffy and light, have a tangy, distinctive taste, and then that sort of crispy. He made this cheese souffle. I don't eat dairy. I don't eat any of that. I don't eat bread anymore. I would eat the entire cheese souffle if it materialized in front of me. And he served it with a sort of dark leafy green salad with garlic dressing. And I remembered that for years. Now, I've done sort of I lead tours all over the world, and they all have food related, and everyone's eating these delicious things while I eat a little, you know, pathetic piece of salmon or whatever. But we were in the restaurants from the cookbook that are still here in the United States are very few and far between. They're almost all in Europe, but here. But New Orleans has 4 of them. So I've gone to New Orleans now a number of times. And at Commander's Palace, I was with a group of people leading this tour, and we're all ordering, and I'm, you know, sort of looking for my sort of pathetic little things that I'm to eat. And one of the women at the opposite side of the table said, oh, I'll have the salad with the garlic dressing. I said, the what? And I looked at it, and I said, I need to have it. It was that garlic dressing, and it was like going back to my past. It was that garlic dressing. It was so delicious. So that was my favorite, the souffle and the garlic. But the other thing he made were popovers, or Yorkshire pudding. Oh my God, and I don't eat that anymore either. And I would have, like, there used to be a restaurant in Manhattan on like the 80s, Upper West Side, that was called the Popover Cafe, and I would just go there and think of my dad. So popovers were another one. And then the other one is something my mom made, which is she made this chocolate cake, and it was like, you all are going to be hungry after this. It was like 6 layers, dark chocolate, and then this like ganache in between with bitter marmalade. So it was like chocolate cake, chocolate bitter ganache, marmalade, and then orange shavings on the top. And the best thing in my childhood was I got to lick that spatula. And then at the end of my dad's life, he, sort of about 10 years before he died, he went to Venice to learn how to cook from Marcella Hazan, who's like the Julia Child of Italy. And at the end of his life, the only thing that tasted good to him was risotto. And so he taught me how to make risotto. And I mean, like, he sat, it's a long process, 40 minutes of stirring.
Yes, it is.
And he sat next to me at the stove and like slapped my hand if I didn't do it right. But I came away knowing how to make risotto. So, and the last final thing is pancakes. Pancakes. I make a mean pancake, and I live in this neighborhood where we have brunches, and I'm always the pancake brunch because my dad absolutely made the mean pancakes. So that's the food.
Awesome. And did you have a question also?
I was going to ask, being conscious of your love for art and how you grew up with art. You grew up around famous painters, and how you very eloquently described your blog and how you're going through life. And I'm wondering if you brought that love of art forward into how you approach your life with very deliberate decisions.
Thank you. So, you know, the thing about growing up, my dad started collecting as a very young man. He bought his first piece of art, a first date Rembrandt etching at 12. Not something most people do. It took him 3 years to pay it off with his allowance. And so for him, really, museums were his church and art was his religion. And it wasn't just, you know, the high arts. I mean, cooking he considered an art, the crafts he considered an art. But for him, art was, when he really got disheartened with the state of the world, he would go into a museum and he thought, if man is capable of creating these things, and they don't all have to be beautiful, they reflect the essence of life, right? Then, you know, to him it was proof that we might survive, right? And so for me, I think what I've recognized is that I value the creative practice. For me, it's words, although I am a photographer, but that's more of a hobby. But I'm never happier than when I'm writing. And so I feel like the most important thing is if you love something that's creative, you have to create the space and the time to do it, and you have to make it a practice. And so I became an art historian. For 10 years I had one of the top galleries in the world, and one of the great loves of my dad's life was Native American art, and a big component of that gallery was I was a top Native American art dealer. Thank you. But you know, what I really realized was that I didn't love having to persuade people what they should buy, because now people buy as an investment. And the investment is this, you know? And so when I lead my tours, every time we go to a museum, I assign everybody the same thing. I say, we're gonna play the game I played when I was a kid. So we're all gonna have lunch together afterwards, and you're gonna take a picture, not of your favorite thing in the museum, not of the thing that, you know, knocked your socks off the most, but the thing you would like to live with every single day. And then we're gonna sit around the table and you're gonna tell us why. And I've learned more about the people I go on these tours with, about why they would choose something. And sometimes they'll show something else, like I love this one, or this one blew my mind, but I would like to live with this one because. And it's usually a very intimate reason, and I play that every time I go to a museum. And so it's, you know, it's putting your heart in it, and then committing to keeping that heart-centered practice. Thank you for that question.
That's a great question. And I think that's a wonderful place to close.
Okay.
We have just about exhausted our hour. Victoria, I can't thank you enough for being here.
Thank you
You've
for
been a
having me.
delight, and she'll be here all weekend. You're also doing your presentation
I
tomorrow.
have a presentation tomorrow, and I'll, the things we talked about today I won't talk about, but I have some really fun slides that people don't usually get to see, and it's sort of about my dad's philosophy of life. So, thank
Victoria
you so
Price.
much.